pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Exodus chapter 7, verses 4 and 5, we read, "But Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that I may lay my hand upon Egypt and bring forth mine armies, and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." I heard about a little boy who was learning all about Moses and Pharaoh and then eventually the Red Sea in Sunday school. And of course, after Sunday school, Mum asked him what did he learn about Moses and Pharaoh and then eventually the Red Sea. And he started off, "Well, Mum, the night before Israel were let free or let go, we find the Israelites, they bombed the Egyptians. And then as they were leaving, they left in a mighty convoy of tanks. And then as they would have looked up into the sky, they would have seen all manner of fighter jets just protecting the Israelites. And then, of course, they came to Pontoon Bridge. And all the Israelites, they crossed over very safely over to the other side of Pontoon Bridge. And of course, as soon as the Egyptians landed on Pontoon Bridge, then the fighter jets, they rained their bombs. And of course, the bridge exploded and all of the Egyptians, they fell into the Red Sea. They were blown to smithereens. And of course, the mother said, "Well, it just didn't happen like that." And the young lad sadly responded, "Well, I know, but if I told you what really happened, you just wouldn't believe it." You know, when we think about Pharaoh in Exodus chapters 7 through 10, you can hardly believe that Pharaoh responds every single time to these plagues, to these miracles, with simply hardening his heart. But after every single plague and after every single miracle, this is how he responds. And you know, it's amazing because we have learned many things about Moses in these last few Sundays, but we have learned that Moses himself has experienced the comfort and consolation of God many times, but Moses himself nearly is a bit of an unbeliever as well. God has said to him many times, "I'll be with you, Moses. I'll go with you. Speak for me and I'll be with you. I'll touch your mouth. I'll give you the words," etc. Chapter 4, however, verse 21, we read, "The Lord said to Moses, when you go to return to Egypt, see that you do all these wonders before Pharaoh, but I will harden his heart that he shall not let the people go." Why did God have to say to that in Moses in chapter 4? Very simply, because he was still struggling with what God had said to him in chapter 3 in the burning bush. And then last week we thought of how Moses eventually went in chapter 5 and said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." He didn't let them go, and then he asked them to be at least led away to the wilderness for a few days to worship. And we find that he was disappointed, and eventually that led to disillusionment. Now, where did we leave Moses last week? Well, chapter 6, verse 21, the children of Israel, the Lord, he hears Moses say, "Children of Israel have not hearkened to me. How then shall Pharaoh hear me, who am of uncircumcised lips?" So still in chapter 6, Moses himself is a bit of an unbeliever. Now, he's a child of God, but it seems he still struggles. He's still doubting the fact that God will be with him and God will bless him as he speaks to Pharaoh. And we find in chapters 7 to 10 that God's going to do many wonderful things, as we're going to see, but he's going to make a believer out of Moses, and also he's going to make a believer, not in the salving sense or the saving sense, but he's going to make a believer even out of Pharaoh, because Pharaoh is going to be left without excuse as he experiences all these miracles and witnesses the mighty power of God. You see, we must remember that up until this point, it's been all plain sailing for Pharaoh, hasn't it? Everything's gone his own way. If this was a football match and it was half-time, Pharaoh would be 3 or 4-0 up. He would have many up on Moses because he has just said no time and time again. And it seems for all intents and purposes that Pharaoh is on the winning side. But no. He's going to experience these plagues, these miracles. That's what they were. These miracles to display the mighty power of God. I should point out that they are miracles. Yes, we think of them as plagues, but the scriptures here describe them as signs and wonders. And let me just be clear in this, folks. So many times in the Bible, people think that the Bible's full of miracles. It's not. Might sound controversial, but what do I mean? Really, there are only 3 eras in Bible history where you have many miracles, a cluster of miracles, and they are even only confined to a specific locality as well. The first era is in the life of Moses, where we're going to see many miracles were performed. We've seen Moses perform miracles already with his rod. You think even of the days of Elijah and Elisha, another era for 30, 40, 50 years where God comes and God sends miracles. And then you think of the days of Christ and the apostles. Of course, they wrought many signs and wonders. Well, folks, in amongst that all are thousands of years where there are virtually no miracles, or else very few miracles. There were a few miracles done, yes, and during the time of the captivity and in Ezekiel's day, but largely speaking, God comes, and at specific times for specific reasons, he deals and he sends many signs and wonders, or many miracles. Let me ask you a question today. What's a miracle? Is it a miracle when perhaps you have a near miss in the car? Is it a miracle when maybe you leave the children for a little while and of course you come in and they're playing with the electric sockets and you just stop them there just in time? Is it a miracle when you just catch something and you escape some kind of thing breaking or doing real bad damage? Is that a miracle? That's an act of providence. That's the kindness and mercy of God. But that is not an act of God in the sense that it's not a miracle. What is a miracle then? Well, someone has defined a miracle as a supernatural intrusion into the natural law that can only be explained as an act of God. In other words, it's where the supernatural invades the natural. And that really only then can be done by God. Per se, chance happenings, providence, they do happen, but whilst they may have the hand of God over them, they are not miracles of God per se. We might call them that, but they're not really. They're acts of providence, strictly speaking. But you know what you find, child of God? You find that whether it's through providence or whether at times it even could be through miracles, as in the 3 times when I've outlined to you, what is God showing us here generally? He's showing that God, he interrupts, he invades your lives with providential happenings. And what is he doing in that? He's showing that he is Jehovah, that he is El Shaddai, the Lord Almighty, that he is the mighty, everlasting, powerful God. Things happen in your life, child of God, and you may not experience a plague, and I trust that we don't. But things do happen. And that is God showing you his mighty power in your life and over all things as he works all things out, counsel of his own will. So let's think today about these preaching plagues as they preach to not only Pharaoh and Egypt, but even the known world at that time. The plagues, they preach the power of God. They preached a few other things, but they mainly preach the power of God. Now, I could turn you to many references in Exodus 7 through 10, but in Romans 9 verse 17, where we have God setting forth the doctrine of sovereign election, we read that Pharaoh is used as an example in Romans 9:17. Now listen to this. We read that the scripture says to Pharaoh, "For this purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee." Now listen to it. "And that my name might be declared throughout the whole earth." And what you find there is Paul is telling the church at Rome and us today that God raised Pharaoh up. Why? To show his mighty, supernatural, heaven-sent power in his life. And not only that, but that would be declared throughout the whole earth at that time. And of course, even the whole earth today. That's why God raised up Pharaoh, to show his power in Pharaoh and through Pharaoh. Now, even before we get to the plagues, the first half of Exodus 7, Pharaoh has already understood the mighty power of God. We have this interesting incident, verses 10 through 12, where Aaron throws down the rod of Moses, really as it is, but Aaron throws it down and it becomes a snake. And then what does Pharaoh do? He calls his magicians, and they throw their rod down, and of course it becomes a snake miraculously as well. And what happens? Well, you know well the story. I'm sure they even heard of it as a child. Aaron's rod and Moses' rod, the snake, it devours the snake of Pharaoh. Now, what is God saying to Pharaoh even before the plagues? Well, Pharaoh really, the emblem of Pharaoh was a snake. Pharaoh actually, if you look at pictures in Egyptian history, he had this headdress that really was a cobra. And so what you find here is that as Aaron's snake devoured Pharaoh's snake, you might say, he's actually already displaying the mighty power of God over Pharaoh in the simple act of the snake of Moses and Aaron devouring the snake of Pharaoh. Now, into these plagues, scholars tell us that the 10 plagues, they could really be split up into three. 3 groups of 3, and then the death of the firstborn, where it all culminates in the 10th plague. We also were going to see that they increase in severity. So it starts off, plague number 1, with the plague of water into blood, and then it finishes up in plague number 9. The whole land is full of darkness for 3 days, and that would have struck a real blow at the heart of Egyptian life. And of course then the death of the firstborn, which was the worst plague of them all. You also find that in these groups, the 3 groups of 3, that the first, the fourth, and the seventh, so the first plague in each of these 3 groups, God, he sets forth the reason and the aim of the plague. In chapter 7, verse 17, chapter 8, verse 22, chapter 9, verse 14, you have the first, fourth, and seventh plague, and you will see that. What is the reason for this particular group of plagues? And to very simply sum it up, it's very simply that they would know God is the Lord and there is none other like him. That is why God is sending these plagues to Egypt and to Pharaoh, that they would see the mighty power of God, that they would understand there's no God like this God, like our God. And so, this is what Egypt is learning in Pharaoh. He's showing his supremacy and his power over them. And there's an interesting insight also into these plagues in chapter 12, verse 12. But there, of course, we have the Passover and all that pertains to that. But speaking of these plagues, we read there that he sent these plagues against all the gods of Egypt. I will execute judgment. In other words, it was a display of power, but it was also a judgment upon Egypt and upon Pharaoh himself. Now let's get into these plagues and see the mighty power of God at work. The first 3 plagues I've called plagues of irritation. And what I mean by that is that in these plagues, the Egyptians' lives, they were really irritated, you might say. Think of the first one, the water into blood. And this obviously is clearly seen as the River Nile, especially being turned into blood. Chapter 7, verses 17 and 18. Thus saith the Lord, in this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. I will smite the rod that's in my hand upon the waters which are in the river. They shall be turned to blood, and even the detail, the fish that's in the river, shall die. The Egyptians, they had many, many gods, but one of their supreme gods was the god of the Nile. They trusted in this god because the Nile was the basic way of life. They depended on the Nile to survive. Virtually every other spring or river, whatever, in Egypt, there's very, very dirty water in Egypt, still even is today. And really the Nile was their main source of fresh water. They needed it really to survive. Obviously we've read here in this verse of the fish dying in the water as well, couldn't survive in this bloody water. So they couldn't drink this water, and obviously fishing, that's a no-go. This water also provided pasture for hunting and even for irrigation, and even transporting goods throughout Egypt. The Nile ran throughout Egypt. And so what you find here is that God is irritating them by striking them in the very, very heart of natural and normal life. What would this be likened to today? It would be likened to coming up to Christmas and you go to Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, whatever, and there's nothing there to buy. You imagine that in the next few weeks. To try and buy a present, to try and buy some food, to try and get a turkey or two. And nobody has anything. The shelves are absolutely empty. That's really what it would have been like. No, you could still survive, but it certainly would irritate you, wouldn't it? That's what's happening here. Now, you would think with this, Pharaoh would begin to listen to the Lord, but chapter 7, verse 23, simply, we read of Pharaoh, nonchalantly, he went into his house. Didn't faze him for a week. This happened. He just went into his house as if nothing happened. The second plague, chapter 8, verse 1, not nice one, the plagues, or the frogs, sorry. You just imagine that this morning. Everywhere you look, frogs. I've tried to imagine this morning, getting up out of bed and looking underneath the quilts and seeing frogs and having frogs jump out at you. Maybe you check even in the pajamas or whatever, and there's frogs hopping out. You look in the pillowcase, and if there's a wee frog or two, and it jumps out, it certainly would have irritate you, wouldn't it? Now, the frog was also a god in Egypt, to the point where if you mistakenly stood on a frog, you experienced the death penalty. That's how sacred the frog was in Egypt. What's God doing here? You imagine the Egyptians now standing in frogs every time they see one, showing how futile worshipping a frog really is. What's God doing? God is showing here the futility of their idolatry. Now again, you would think Pharaoh would want rid of these frogs as quickly as possible. Chapter 8, verse 10, Moses comes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, do you want rid of the frogs? I'm paraphrasing here. Look at chapter 8, verse 10. He said, tomorrow. Tomorrow. If you had frogs all over the place, you'd want rid of them as quickly as possible. He said, tomorrow? Why? Because even amongst the irritation, he still was an idolater. And he wanted one more night with the frogs. There's old Baptist preachers, and a couple of them have preached one more night with the frogs. Let me just pause and ask you the question. What is it that you're holding on to that really is just an idol? And when you think about it, it's just a futile idol. And yet, if the challenge comes to you right now, give it up, follow Jesus Christ. I wonder would you reply like Pharaoh, just give me one more night with it. One more night with that person. One more night with that habit. One more night with that thing. Selling out the Lord for one more night with the frogs. That's really all you're doing. We must move on. The third plague. The third plague in each of these groups of three, they came without warning. Without warning. The other two, so the first, second, the fourth and the fifth, etc., there were warnings, but the third one came without warning. Chapter 8, verse 16, we have the plague of lice or gnats, or as the psalmist even translated it as we sang this morning in Psalm 78, worms. Really just the little, as we would call them, the little bed bugs, the little lice, the little creatures, the little things. We would talk about things getting under our skin, wouldn't we? And that's the thought of that colloquialism. Things get under the skin and they gnaw away at us, don't they? They annoy us, they frustrate us. Because they're little critters, they get under the skin and they bite and they gnaw. Oh, just they irritate, don't they? Particular thing mentioned here. It's been known to bite the ear, crawl up the nostril, then even in the hair. We know of head lice today, down the neck. These things, they were really starting, pardon the pun, to bug the Egyptians, weren't they? Really starting to gnaw at them, really starting to irritate them. Not changing their lives permanently, but certainly irritating them. God sends irritation your way, my friend, to show you that He is in control of even the little irritations that you have in life. He's over them. He sends them. So we thought about the first three plagues of irritation. Think with me about the second three plagues of interruption. You see, they're getting more difficult. They're increasing in intensity. The fourth plague, the flies. Chapter 8, verse 21 speaks of swarms of flies. The term swarm here in the Hebrew, it means mixture. And so what you have here is all sorts of flies. You imagine dragonflies and the bumblebee and the wasp and the hornet and all of these flies just clumped together. I've tried to imagine a satellite image looking down at the land of Egypt when you read how it's described here, it speaks of the clouds being thick with these flies. You couldn't move, you couldn't see. It would have essentially been like a sandstorm that you just can't see. All sorts of flies. I believe that whenever you would have looked down from heaven, or even a satellite image, as I've said, remember, these are only coming in the Egyptians. So you imagine looking down from heaven and just seeing where the flies, and there being a straight line, or the line of the boundary line or the border, and it just stops at the land of Goshen. All these flies, and then you look over the hedge at the neighbour, and there's not a fly in the house, not a fly in sight. That's what was going on here. God was dealing with the Egyptians, and he was sparing his people in the land of Goshen. The fifth one now is where it gets personal. There's greater interruption here, livestock and cattle. And so he causes these cows, these livestock, to be sick, many of them to die. The Egyptians, they would have relied on these cattle, obviously, for making money, for survival. Remember, the Israelites, they were shepherds, but the Egyptians, well, they were cattlemen. But now the livestock, the very livestock has been smitten. And so here he's invading their personal property. But then look at the next plague, the plague of boils, chapter 9. What a plague this was. Really the idea of an ulcer that pussed. I'm sure you have at times had an old nasty ulcer. And it's pussing. It's not nice at all. And remember that this was over all of their bodies. Chapter 9 verse 10 shows how indiscriminate it was upon man and upon beast. So even the beast that survived the plague of the fifth plague, the beasts then, they experienced these ulcers. Chapter 9 verse 11, the next verse, upon the magicians. If you read chapter 9 verse 11 and following, do you know what you'll find? It says the magicians could not even stand before Moses because of the boils. It's as if they couldn't stand for a prolonged period of time to even speak to Moses. This is how irritable it was for them. Oh, God is starting now, not just to irritate, but even to interrupt their very way of life, how they make money, and even their health. God's really making it personal now, isn't he? Oh, he's really invading, isn't he? He's touching them where they are starting now to really feel it. And that's what God does to you, child of God. And even my friend, if you're not a Christian, in order to display his power, he will send the irritations. But if that doesn't get your attention, then he will interrupt. Why is it that at times the health just isn't what it should be? God's just sending that health warning to remind you that he is powerful, he is mighty, and he's in control of every aspect of the life. You think even of your personal property, your very wealth, and at times you can go through hardship there, can't you? And yet for all of it, God, even there, he's been stirring the nest. He's been interrupting your life, hasn't he? You think of Job. God spoke to him through the loss of health. Remember how it describes Job? He had similar boils, I believe, to the Egyptians. And it speaks of him having a potsherd, and he had to try and scrape his skin because it was so painful, so irritable. You think of Jonah. There he was in chapter 4 having a little pity party. God created a gourd, and the very next day, the gourd that he created, he destroyed. He sent a worm to eat the gourd. What do you find in these plagues? That God, he speaks to you. God speaks once, yea, twice. And he's been speaking to your life, my friend. Showing ultimately, as he was showing these individuals, showing the Egyptians, showing Pharaoh, even showing the people of God conversely, that he is a mighty, powerful God. And if we do not trust him in every aspect of our lives, then he will not merely irritate, but he will interrupt. He will interrupt. Think of the last three then, very quickly. The seventh plague, the plague of hail, chapter 9, verses 22 to 26. This wasn't just hailstones that we have experienced in here in Ulster. It speaks of the hail being mingled with fire. This is a miracle in itself, because obviously hail is just really essentially frozen water. So this is a miracle in itself. And these hail, essentially what happened here is that this hail, it killed any animal remaining. So any animal that escaped the plague of livestock and the sixth plague, anything then that was left was destroyed. It either was destroyed because of the ferocity of these hailstones or else the fire, depending on the animal. Even plant life was destroyed. I remember being in Australia on holiday, and whenever I was about 8 or 9, got out of school, and we have family in Australia, and in the middle of spring they had a freak hailstorm. Now I'm not exaggerating, folks. Hail over there, it was the size of a golf ball. They had to cover their cars to protect their windscreens. Now, that wasn't a miracle. That's just natural geography. These hails, they must have been absolutely massive, these hailstones. Absolutely massive. There's actually a record of someone being knocked out by some of those hailstones in Australia. I remember it very well. It was a freak in a sense. And surely if God could do that today, how big must these hailstones have been? How ferocious must they have been, mingled with fire? God is almighty, you see. Plague of hail. Should also say that, remember, the Egyptians, they worshipped the God of the sky. Egypt, if you've ever been to Egypt, you'll find that the weather doesn't really change too much all year. Sunny really throughout and not really all that much darkness. Of course, it's near the equator, that's why. Very consistent weather. And they would have worshipped the God of the sky to maintain that. Now here we find the God of over all the skies is invading their lives through the skies, sending this hail. Plague of locusts, chapter 10, verses 12 to 15. What were the locusts like? Well, I heard the story of two ladies one day, and they were talking. One of them said to the other that they had a visit from the locust pastor. And what did that mean? The other lady said, the local pastor. No, the locust pastor or preacher. And she said, well, what does that mean? He said, well, he was a wee man. He had everything set in front of him, and he leaves nothing behind him whenever he leaves. And folks, that's exactly what the locusts were like. They were fairly small, but they ate everything in front of them, and they left nothing behind them. Locusts, I'm told, can eat their whole body weight in one day. They can fly for approximately 20 out of the 24 hours in the day. When they fly, they can rise up to speeds between 10 and 12 miles per hour. Yes, they were small, but boys, they packed a great punch, didn't they? A great appetite as well. Now you just imagine the Egyptians. Now they're just literally trying to eke out a living. Everything's gone. Plant life's gone. Livestock's gone. So anything that they have to survive, the moment that they begin to try and eke out something, a locust is just going to come along and eat it on them. God is irritated. God is interrupted. God is now invading their lives and changing their lives in these last three plagues, the plague of hail and the plague of locusts. And then lastly, the ninth plague, the plague of darkness. Chapter 10, verse 21. Who was the god that they worshipped more than most other gods in Egypt? Ra, the sun god. It's actually believed that Moses, when he was learned in the ways of Egypt, he studied in the temple of Ra, the sun god, when he was learned in all the ways of Egypt. You imagine this. They look up and all they're being used to is sunny skies, really, for most of their lives, and not much darkness. Now for 3 days, 3 whole days straight. Remember, no street lights, nothing like that. Just absolute, abject darkness. Couldn't see a thing. Couldn't see where they were going. Literally, quite literally, I'm not exaggerating, they literally couldn't see past the end of their nose. Absolute darkness, a thick cloud of darkness. God is showing here, you worship the sun god, you trust in the sun god. I'll send darkness for 3 days. For 3 days to show you that I am the God over all other supposed gods. Has God been speaking to your life, child of God? Has he been invading your life? He's showing you very simply that he is the mighty powerful God. And you would do well to listen to him. Because as we think of the last plague, the 10th, and I will just finish with this, we'll come back to it next week. I notice the time. But the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. This is going to change many Egyptian families forever. Forever. Think about that. Any family who's lost a loved one, lost a little one, you'll know that it's very difficult to take. And it changes that family forever. And here we see in this last plague that God is going to change. Remember, as the author of life, the sustainer of life, and the remover of life, as sovereign over life and death, God is going to change the fabric of family life for many Egyptians forever. And that's a warning to you, my friend, if you're not saved, to listen to the mighty God of heaven, because he has the power to intervene in every aspect of life. And he can change your life forever. And so it would do well to listen to him and to obey him and to submit your life to him. And child of God, again, there's a warning here. I know Pharaoh was an unbeliever. I know Pharaoh had a hard heart. But God sends irritations, then interruptions, and then invasions. And if we do not even listen to the invasion, at times he changes our lives forever. And this is a warning to us all. That these plagues, they are preaching plagues, aren't they? They're plagues that preach to us. There's an old cartoon, I'll finish with this, from the 90s. It's called Frank and Ernest. And they were various things, various episodes, one of them funny sort of cartoons. But in one particular episode, they're standing at the very gates of heaven. And Ernest has on his t-shirt, a printed t-shirt, with the words very simply, "Question authority." And in this cartoon, Frank whispers into his ear, "Ernie, you'd be safer changing your t-shirt rather than questioning the authority of heaven." My friend, you'd be better putting those changes into your life that need to be put right, those things that need to be set right, lest you question the authority of heaven on your life. We'll come back to this, about the preaching plagues. And I trust that even though we've just gone through them this morning, that we've learned and that we've been challenged this morning. We'll close our service by